Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, wherever you are. This is a nice big group. I am Dr. Michelle Veneziano. I'm a practicing cranial osteopath, family medicine doctor, and former hospitalist. So I sort of span the worlds between the mystical and the evidence-based, although we know plenty of mysticism is evidence-based. And today we're going to look at how powerfully the tongue affects the ability for the cranium and sacrum to communicate, stay in synchronous motion. And it also is a placeholder of this central axis of communication and life force circulation, which I like to call the central channel. There are many names for this activation, primary axis, which all physical and subtle anatomy references and remains stable in relation to. When I teach people how to work with their tongues, they're infinitely easier to treat osteopathically, and they need many fewer treatments. So we're going to do some slides, but I'd like to give you an overview. I'm going to keep repeating the main takeaway points because it's a big topic, but it's actually very simple at its root. And the kernel of it is a thing to get as an understanding on an intuitive level. So a well-functioning tongue, my first slide says a well-functioning tongue is like having an osteopath or craniosacral therapist living in your head. And I said that sort of jokingly years ago, and it's really the summary of it's so true. And so I quote myself a lot on that, and you're willing to plagiarize that, to steal it. So the tongue, a well-functioning tongue exerts 1 to 6 pounds of pressure depending on the studies that you read. And of course it's a muscle, so it really depends on fitness and many other features. 1 to 6 pounds of pressure northward, which is cephalad in cranial speak, or toward the crown of the head. And this happens every time we swallow 1 to 2,000 times a day. So this action is mobilizing the big hinge of bone at the center of the skull. And it's also creating that activation of this central axis, as I mentioned. It also maintains an opening in the in the roof of the mouth that in Vedic teachings is called the Soma Chakra, which allows the heart to communicate with the higher centers. So there's a mechanical layer and there's a subtle layer that have very universal and profound effects on the entire system. And I would say the summary of that is that the tongue is largely the placeholder of subtle body, physical body integration. And that's when we really hit our fluid state, really. And the whole point of cranial and osteopathy is to achieve this subtle body, physical body integration, so that as we move through space, we're accessing our fluid nature, and we learn to live in a place where we're very resilient and adaptable. Good morning, everyone. Coming to you live from Santa Fe, New Mexico. Brilliant wildlife happening outside, lots of bird sounds. And my purpose today is to give you a 2-minute overview on what this course is about. You probably watched or are about to watch several clips from class, and none of them name the overarching guiding principle of my approach to self-healing and supporting of others, which is essentially a return to native behaviors, practices or ways of being that simply become part of every moment of our day and don't require extra time. So we begin with mindset. Really, how is it that we cultivate our attention to basically be in what we call cause or agency of our influence on our own bodies, the environment, others, our ability to connect, ground, and actually feel what's happening in our tissues, because physiology responds to attention. That's probably number one. And then we, of course, work with the hygiene of our beliefs and thoughts and the way we work with our emotions. All of these are highly relevant and under referenced in healing and certainly in conventional medicine. So the basics of presencing, right? Embodiment, getting into the body, supporting healing, have to do with awareness of how we move, how we walk, how we sit, how we breathe, how we work with the tongue, because the tongue seems to be a placeholder of all of these behaviors, setting this reference to the electrical patterning of the body through the central axis. I've spoken about this in in every class setting. And then, of course, social engagement is a huge part of it. Understanding the relevance of our tribal nature to healing and learning and enjoying life, and basically arriving in life and living as nature intended, aligned with our purpose, and able to be in service in the world in a meaningful way. I believe I covered all of it. I'm happy to receive questions. I'm excited to meet you. I'm hoping you're considering joining my learning program. This central axis is like a power core. It's a structural power core, structural, like, trunk, like a tree trunk. We don't want it to be rigid, but it says powerful as a tree trunk, the tree trunk of the body. And what happens if we dissociate from the connectivity or the ability for the body to stay awake and communicate through this axis? It's as though the tree trunk is gone and the branches are charged with holding themselves up. And there's just no way for that to go well. When we sit, compress the tailbone, go into our heads, kind of dissociate in terms of our attention on our body, our organism, like our deep primal sense, will not feel safe, and then it's like this domino effect. Everything contracts, typically around the heart, right? The fight or flight position is protective. Retreat. But if you're sitting in a way that's really kind of not attending to the body, like we get into our heads, we're focused on a map or a computer screen, and then we're kind of straining our bodies we're not paying attention to the way we sit, which in the moment doesn't feel like much. But if you sit 8 hours a day in a way that compresses your tailbone and has the muscles kind of struggling to negotiate this non-primacy of this central reference behavior, then you're basically going to be inducing fight or flight. When people start to modify how they use their desks and their car seats, they begin to learn how to not only mitigate the negatives of so much sitting, but actually access the time that we spend sitting so that we can use that as a therapeutic opportunity. We just talked about the big picture, right? We're going to pretty much stay in big picture, but then we're going to dive in a little bit more, go big picture. With each module, we're going to be talking about the same thing, but from a different angle. So it's like it's an elephant. Remember the story with all the blind people touching the elephant, and one says it's a trunk and one says it's a foot, and they're all right, but they're not seeing the big picture. So the water is a foot and the cardiac coherence is a tail, and these are all pieces of an emerging whole. an emergence of a sense of beingness, being an integration between physical, subtle body, planet, environment, connectedness, resonance, coherence. And I think I just described primary respiration. Basically, how it is that all of these forces happen in support of life in a resonant way that is cyclic in relation to the planet and the forces of nature, and how that is the ocean that we live, that's the sea that we swim in, that we largely have chosen to decide doesn't exist, and doesn't make it inaccurate, that it's still probably the single most relevant contributor to health, not health. And we see that in all the mindfulness research and all the research around how effective Qigong is at healing just about anything without speaking to the mechanism. What we're talking about is this very same thing, dropping into entrainment, coherence with this greater symphony of life. And then the collective lives separate from that. But as we explore it together and share our stories and grow new neurons for recognizing that location, then we, over the course of this period of time, and the research shows it really only takes 6 to 8 weeks of some kind of daily attuning practice. They're not even talking about group practice or the depth of the kind of practices you, for instance, would be doing. Our practice this week, I will share my suggestion, is that we do this very simple thing of getting present to this, our sense of the most minute, the silence, the stillness, and the most expansive, and practicing what it feels like to hold all of that while we feel our tissues, to connect the entire thing to the body. And I'm trying to do it all the time. Whether I mean, it actually makes quick work of meditative practice in a sense, because when I finally get down on the floor to do my practice, I'm not starting from scratch. It doesn't take me time to drop in. Or if I do some really intense athletic something over the weekend, I'm not starting from so unrecruited that I'm going to injure myself, right? This hydrating of and entraining of all the tissues keeps us engaged and adaptable, and then we have more capacity to keep working our systems to higher levels of ability and adaptability.